In this unit, we're going to start talking about managing our servers. So we talked about installing the servers in the previous unit, so we knew what versions and additions we can use and what those features were. And we talked about how to install all of that stuff. And now we're going to talk about once the installation is complete, now we have to add certain roles and features, and we have to begin setting up our server for administration. And as I talked about before, one of the interesting things about Server 2012 over previous versions of Windows is it allows you to do remote administration much more easily than you could in the past, which also allows us to use server core or the minimal user interface, which means that we may not necessarily need the full user interface on a server since we can manage it remotely. So it's important for us to be aware of these features and how this works, and also how to set up our servers and and how to set up some of the features that we'll talk about later on. So our objectives in this unit are work with server roles and features. We're going to talk about how to install those and how we can start configuring those. We'll get into more detail on that later on. We'll talk about configuring server modes, which would be your minimal user interface, the full GUI, or core, which has very little in the way of user interface. So we'll talk about that. Then we're going to get into how to actually manage your servers remotely using some of the tools that we have in Windows Server 2012. And we'll talk about configuring services, which is a core part of Microsoft Windows Server. Obviously, as if you're running a server, most of the things on the server are going to run as a service. They're not going to be user interactive programs. They'll typically run in the background. So we'll talk about those. We'll also look at configuring NIC teaming. So in a server that needs more bandwidth or more network capability than a standard server, you would have to use multiple NICs, and NIC teaming allows you to do that. So you can get more throughput with a server if you have NIC teaming. So we'll talk a little about how to do that. And then we'll talk about legacy issues with down-level servers. So working with older versions of Microsoft Windows in the same network from which we're using 2012. And really 2012 could be down-leveled from in a network that's mostly 2016, which is now available at the time I'm recording this. All right, so when you install Microsoft Windows Server 2012, the basic installation will include basic file and printer sharing, so that'll be included. But all of the other features and roles we'll have to add. So all of that other stuff that we talk about in this course that you'll see in the syllabus, for example, all of those will have to be added after the installation. So server roles and features can be added and updated through both the GUI installation and a server core installation, and I'll talk about how to do that later on. So in Server Manager, you're going to start the Add Roles and Features wizard in the Welcome window. So when you first start it up, you'll see that Welcome window. You could also click Manage, Add Roles and Features from the menu. And before you begin, a window is going to open up, which you can bypass later on by clicking a little button that says Bypass this in the future. So in this screenshot, you can see the Server Manager. You're going to click on Manage and then Add Roles and Features. You could also just click Add Roles and Features in the center if that's open in the Quick Start, where it says Welcome to Server Manager. And once you bring that up, you'll see a window that looks like this. And you're going to hit that little radio button at the bottom that says Skip this page by default if you don't want to see this every time you open it. There's really no reason for us to see this every single time, so you can hit that little checkbox, and then it'll start taking you directly into the wizard to start setting up your roles and features. So the installation type window has two options. You'll have an option for role-based or feature-based installation, and then remote desktop services installation. So you'll use the first one for the majority of the roles and features that we install. The second option is only for remote desktop services. So you're going to use that to distribute components of remote desktop services across different servers in a virtual desktop infrastructure. We'll talk a little bit more about virtual desktops later on. So typically you'll select that first radio button that you see on the screen that says role-based or feature-based installation. Once you do that, you'll be able to start setting up the features and roles, and you'll see those listed. So in the server selection window, you choose a server from the server pool for installing roles and features, and you can also install roles and features on a virtual disk. What that means is if you have a Windows 2012 server that is a VM that you haven't yet spun up, that's offline, you can actually update that server offline directly in the VHD file. The VHD file is the file in which that virtual machine is held for Hyper-V. So you can also add roles and features directly into that file without even having to start that machine, which is kind of an interesting feature. So if you choose that option, you'll be prompted to choose a server on which to mount the VHD and specify the path to the VHD file. So here in this window, you can see that the local server was selected, the 410 server 1. So that's the local server. Or you could select a virtual hard disk. So this is where you would, if you had installed server core, you might connect to that server core from a remote system. Now, there are some things that you'll have to do before you can actually use the server wizard on a core server that's installed somewhere else, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit. So in the server roles windows, all server roles available to install will be listed, and next to each is a box. So in that box, if it is selected, that means the role is already installed. And if the box is shaded, that means that one or more services subordinate to that role have been installed. If it's not checked, that means you can check that, and that'll install that role or service. So this is what that screen looks like. You can see some of these are shaded, meaning that there are some roles that are installed that are subordinate, but not all. Most of these are unchecked, meaning that they have not yet been installed. So I'd be able to select which of these I'd want to install on my server at this screen. So the features window lists the available features and works just like the server roles window. I'll go back here. So in this window, we're looking at server roles. Features would be the next option. So once a server role with multiple associated role services is selected, the next step is selecting which of the role services are needed. So we go through and select the role services. So the procedure in the server manager, you click manage, remove roles and features from the menu if you want to remove roles. The main difference from the installation wizard, you clear the box for the role or feature that you want to remove if you're trying to remove roles and features. You can also install server roles with the PowerShell. So use PowerShell to add and remove server roles from a server core or GUI server. So this is if you don't want to use the server manager. And again, this is one of the powerful things about Windows Server 2012 is that using server core, we don't need to use the server manager. We can do a lot of these tasks from the PowerShell. So to start the PowerShell, you're going to type PowerShell at an elevated command prompt or right-click on the PowerShell icon and run as administrator. So you right-click, you'll see an option that says run as administrator. By the way, the PowerShell is available in most versions of Windows. So starting with Windows 7, it was standard with Windows. So you should have the PowerShell on most client workstations or workstations versions of Windows in addition to servers. So if you're managing this from a workstation, you'll be able to run the PowerShell. You can also install and uninstall roles and features to and from an offline VHD file by including the option -VHD path name. So you can either connect the PowerShell to a remote server using the UNC path or the IP, or you can use a VHD file, which is again is the Hyper-V file. So you can perform commands on the remote servers by including the parameter string, which specifies the name or IP address of the remote server. So it's just -computer name, and then the string, of course, would be the IP address. So example 1, if you're on server 1 and you want to install Windows Server Backup on server 2, this is what the command would look like. So I type install -Windows feature. So the feature is Windows-Server-Backup, so that's the feature. And then computer name is server 2, although that could be the IP address as well. But in this case, they use the host name, server 2. And then include all sub-features and include management tools, mean to include all of the features and management tools that are subordinate to that role. So this would automatically install that role and feature on that remote server. Desired state configuration is a tool in Windows 2012 which allows you to use the PowerShell to automate the deployment of roles and features to other servers. Basically, it lets you set up a remote server that can host, with a web service, access to the roles and features so that you can write a sort of a batch command to install these roles and services on remote systems. So a DSC script is created in PowerShell's integrated scripting environment. So you're going to open that from the Tools menu in Server Manager. So the basic steps for creating it are to create the script in the PowerShell ISE, run the script to create configuration files called Management Object Files, or MOF, enter the Start DS Configuration commandlet in the PowerShell prompt, and then you can configure DSC. You can also install on offline images. So an offline image is basically a VHD file. So with the PowerShell commandlet, you can install roles and features with the using DSC to offline images, just like we can install roles and features. So you can install and uninstall features to and from the offline VHD file. And the VMs can be kept in an offline state until they're ready to be deployed. So really what that means is that you're able to, with Windows 2012, you're able to take a VHD file that has an image of a 2012 server, and you're able to install roles and features without actually powering on that virtual machine. So you can configure it for whichever roles and features you need before you even turn it on the first time. In the next slide deck, I'm going to talk about configuring server modes. So we'll talk about that in the next slide deck.